Hello everybody, welcome to the Oceans panel. As you know, here at CCL we like to start on time, and for all those people who got stuck in lines for lunch, well, too bad. We want to allow you guys time for asking the questions you want, and so we're gonna dive right in here. We have an exciting panel here for you guys today. We have three speakers. First of all, we have Dr. Ingrid Biedron. She is a marine scientist for Oceana, working as a member of the Climate and Energy team. She focuses on ensuring that marine management policies are founded on sound science and support healthy and sustainable marine ecosystems. Ingrid's background includes research in marine mammal acoustics, fisheries policy, ecosystem-based fisheries management, and the human dimensions of natural resource management. Her doctoral research focused on the implementation of ecosystem-based fisheries management in the Mid-Atlantic and New England Fishery Management Councils. Ingrid holds a BA from Dartmouth College and an MS and PhD from Cornell University. Next, we'll hear from Jeff Waters, and he came aboard at the Ocean Conservancy in 2011. As Director of Government Relations, Jeff leads the team in navigating Capitol Hill and fighting for the goals of Ocean Conservancy and their members among elected officials. Pursuing both his undergraduate and graduate degrees at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, he earned his Master's of Science in Limnology and Marine Science. As a Midwesterner, Jeff has described the impetus for his pursuit of marine science as coast envy. His research of sea turtles brought him to Hawaii in January, which does certainly sound a little bit more temperate than Madison. Although he works closely with Ocean Conservancy's fish and ocean acidification teams, he now works on behalf of all their programs and members. And then we have Kristen Yarincik, and she is the Vice President and Director of Research and Education, providing strategic and programmatic oversight for the Consortium for Ocean Leadership's research and education-related programs. Kristen additionally serves as the Director of the National Ocean Sciences Bowl, the Consortium for Ocean Leadership's flagship education program. Projects currently in her purview at the Consortium for Ocean Leadership include the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative, a 10-year program for studying the impacts of Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the Interagency Ocean Observations Committee, the Deep Ocean Observing Strategy, the National Ocean Science Bowl, as well as other projects in ocean literacy, education, and workforce development for the ocean sciences. Kristen serves on the International Advisory Group for the EU-funded Sea Change Project. She received a bachelor's degree in environmental geosciences from Boston College, and she received a master's degree in earth science from Boston University, focusing her research on paleoceanography. They're each going to give a 10 to 12 minute talk here at the podium, and then we're going to have time for questions. We have a couple of interns who are in the back. Could you wave your hands? They're going to have comment cards. And so if you do have a question, perhaps you guys could come down here to the sides and you can grab a comment card from them. When you're done with your comment card, bring it to them and they'll bring it up here. And that's how we'll do the questions. So I do want to allow you time to get to your questions. So Ingrid.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I'm Ingrid Biedron, and I'm at Oceana, which is a NGO group. We're an international organization, but we do have our headquarters here in Washington, D.C. And I'll be talking with you about offshore oil and gas exploration, and specifically seismic airgun blasting and its impacts on marine life. So as I mentioned, Oceana is an international ocean organization, and we focus on science conservation, and our campaigns are science-based. So here are the 4 parts of my talk today. First, I'll be talking about why we care about seismic airgun blasting and what it is. Next, the impacts on marine life, the permitting process, and then finally, citizen engagement. And just to put things in context, seismic airgun blasting, which I'll be talking about more, it's an invasive, loud survey technique that's used to look for oil and gas reserves under the seafloor. And there were 4 permits proposed in the Atlantic last year, and the Obama administration rejected those permits in early January. But just in this last week, actually, that permitting process has been reversed, and seismic airgun blasting in the Atlantic is on the table again. So that kind of brings, this is a very current event, and there's going to be decisions made about whether or not to allow it in the Atlantic within the next couple months. So what is seismic airgun blasting? Well, first of all, and why should we care? Well, we should care because currently there are 4 permits under review for seismic airgun blasting in the Atlantic, spanning from Delaware all the way down to Florida. And these are the permits being reviewed right now by the Trump administration. And there are lots of threats to marine ecosystems and local communities from seismic airgun blasting. And these include impacts to fishing, to whales, turtles, invertebrates, and therefore impacts to communities and the fishing communities, tourism, and recreation. Also, if seismic airgun blasting is actually the first step in offshore drilling, and so if offshore drilling actually did happen in the Atlantic, there could be industrialization of the coastline, risks of chronic, well, there would be chronic leaks and everyday spills, and then a risk for a big BP-like spill. And also drilling of exploratory wells, even if the decision hasn't been made to drill offshore. So what is this seismic airgun blasting or seismic airgun surveying? As I mentioned, it's a process used to look to see what natural resources are under the seafloor. And so what happens is a ship tows this seismic array, as you can see here in the picture. And these seismic airguns shoot blasts of sound down through the water column. The water travels through the seafloor and then bounces back up to the surface where those echoes are recorded. And then analysts can determine to a certain degree if there are oil and gas resources in that area. And the air guns shoot loud blasts of air that are equivalent to this. They are really the second loudest source of man-made sound in the oceans. And so you have these ships towing these arrays, doing seismic surveys, and the seismic blasts from each air gun happen every 10 to 12 seconds. And they can happen for days, weeks, months, even a year at a time. Most of these permits under review right now are for surveys up to a year. And these sounds are so loud that they can actually be heard up to 2,500 miles. So that's the distance between New York City and LA. So sound travels very efficiently underwater, and it can travel a long way. And finally, the sound from these seismic air guns would be in addition to all the loud noises in the oceans already, from shipping, from military exercises, from weather. So they'd just be adding to the cacophony of sound in the oceans. Here's a picture. Here's a seismic ship towing an array of air guns. This chart here shows an example of a survey track. So the seismic ships move back and forth and back and forth and back and forth over their proposed area, trying to figure out what resources are underwater and under the seafloor, and sometimes they actually have to run those track lines more than once. Sorry if that was really loud, but it's way quieter than it is in real life. So that's an example of what the animals under the water are going to be hearing if this happens. As I mentioned, these sounds can travel, as you can maybe imagine, up to 2,500 miles, and they're so loud that they can actually penetrate about 6 miles into the seafloor. There's an example of an array with several air guns hanging from it, and then there's a picture of a single air gun there. And here's a huge array. The largest seismic arrays can be up to 96 air guns, and the largest array ever spans an area 3.5 times the size of Central Park. All right, so that's what seismic airgun blasting is. Now, what are the impacts on marine life? We know that seismic airgun blasting can impact fish, turtles, whales, invertebrates. There's lots of science showing that there are impacts to marine life. Here's an example of just a few of the publications out there. So why is sound important in the oceans? Why does it matter to animals? Well, we know that these animals that are in the oceans use sound for communication and behaviors that are important to survival. And these include things like finding mates, keeping track of young, finding food, maybe listening for predators or navigating. And so when you have something like seismic air guns in the oceans, that's going to mask their ability to use sound for these activities. So as I mentioned before, we know whales, fish, turtles, and even invertebrates are impacted by seismic noise. This map here is actually publicly available data, most of it from National Marine Fisheries Service, that shows important habitat areas for endangered sea turtles, endangered whales, commercially and recreationally important fish. And as you can see, all those different colors are where those animals are living. And then the kind of shaded overlayers are the areas that are proposed for seismic airgun blasting. And this is a huge area where these surveys are proposed. As I said, it's from Delaware down to Florida, from 20 kilometers offshore all the way out to 350 miles offshore. So that's the sound of a fish making a noise. So noise and sounds are important to fish. Some species use noise for mating, finding mates, and if there's loud background noise, their ability to use sounds for those activities are going to be disrupted. We also know that some fish have swim bladders, kind of like inflated balloons inside of them, and if they're too close to the seismic airgun noise, those can actually get damaged, and the fish can potentially die because the bubble bursts and then they float to the surface. Science shows that for some commercially important species, catch rates decrease 40 to 80% in the presence of seismic airgun noise. They can be displaced from habitats, and they can actually have some physical damage if they're close enough to the sound source. Other studies have showed up to a 78% decline in habitat use, increased levels of stress hormones, and schools of fish actually moving out of their usual habitat areas. So commercial and recreational fishermen are worried about the fish that they go after being displaced, because then they won't be able to use their usual fishing grounds to catch fish. So next I'll talk about impacts to whales. And the government's own estimates show that seismic airgun noise, if these permits are approved, could harm up to, or actually injure up to 138,000 marine mammals and disturb or displace millions more. So if you think about that, that's a lot of whales and dolphins. We're particularly concerned about the North Atlantic right whale. This is an extremely endangered species, and there are only about 500 left, and recently we've seen their population start to decline, and we know that even negative impacts to one or two females could cause that population to start to tip even more sharply towards extinction. And this red area here on the chart is the only known calving ground for North Atlantic right whales, and unfortunately that calving ground is squarely in the same area as the proposed airgun surveys. So those are right whale sounds. So we know right whales use sounds to keep track of young, to find food, and to find mates. This is a humpback whale sound. Again, studies show that seismic airgun noise can displace humpbacks from their habitat, mass communication, cause chronic stress in baleen whales in general, and actually potentially cause auditory damage if the whales are close enough to the seismic noise. There are even more studies that show that sperm whales, their vocalizations to hunt are changed around seismic airgun noise. Bowhead whales actually are silenced in the presence of noise, and fin whales avoid important habitat. Loggerhead sea turtles, so endangered loggerhead sea turtles, they have critical habitat areas that have been designated under the Endangered Species Act, also in this area proposed for seismic airgun blasting. So conservationists and scientists are concerned that seismic noise could disrupt their nesting behavior. And studies show that seismic airgun noise does cause avoidance and alarm responses in turtles, and there's even a slight risk of entanglement in the actual seismic gear. And then finally, seismic even impacts invertebrates, and we're talking about invertebrates like oysters, clams, things that are important for industry and that a lot of us like to eat. There are negative impacts to development in the larva, there's stress responses, and actually developmental delays. Again, more studies that show invertebrates are impacted by seismic noise. So now I will move forward to the actual permitting process for seismic airgun blasting. Don't worry about all the details, I'm just trying to get the main point across. And the main point is that there are a lot of permits out there for seismic airgun blasting right now. This is from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's website. Each of those outlines represents one permit that has been submitted to be reviewed for seismic testing in the Atlantic. Again, this area is about twice the size of California. And this is really messy, but there are two agencies involved in approving seismic airgun permits. One is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM. The other is the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NIMS. Basically, we're trying to get all the way to the right. If they want to get their permits, if the companies want to get their permits for seismic testing, they have to get all the way to the right of that chart. Currently, the companies in BOEM have pretty much finished everything except the NIMS IHAs. You see the red-orange boxes there on the bottom. That is the section for incidental harassment authorizations, or IHAs. Now, I know that sounds kind of funky and kind of complicated, but basically, under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, if anybody, scientists, industry, wants to do an activity that's going to hurt marine life, or marine mammals specifically, they have to get permission to hurt the animals. And the IHAs are that permission. And so the last step before these seismic permits can be given to these companies is for the NIMS, or National Marine Fisheries Service, to release these IHAs. And actually, those IHAs were released last Tuesday for public comment, and there's a mandatory 30-day comment period, so you are all welcome to comment on those IHAs and voice your concern if you're concerned. But after that 30-day comment period, those permits can be issued and boats could be in the water. So that means boats could be in the water within a month. And under normal circumstances, it would take months for these comments to be reviewed, but we don't really know these days. So again, the IHAs have been issued, they're out for comment, and we could have permits approved in 30 days. How am I doing for time? Am I doing okay? Okay, so I'm going to breeze through a few things. Basically, in the most recent administration, there have been executive orders that have encouraged speeding up the process for approving offshore oil and gas exploration, offshore drilling, and these IHAs being approved last week is evidence that, yes, the industry is being helped along to get their permits approved. So what are we recommending? Well, Oceana is recommending, and our fellow NGOs, that we don't want seismic airgun blasting in the Atlantic. It's harmful to marine life, and if they're going to do it, they should only do one survey. They should look at cumulative impacts, and we should also be using the best science and look at alternative energies, such as offshore wind. And finally, what can citizens do? What can you do? Well, first of all, over 120 cities along the coast have already formally voiced their opposition to seismic and offshore drilling. 1,200 elected officials have also voiced their opposition. There's an alliance representing over 41,000 businesses and 500,000 fishing families that have said they don't want seismic happening. Also, the fishery management councils, both the South and Mid-Atlantic fishery management councils, have sent letters to the administration saying they're concerned about seismic and the impacts on fish, and even NASA and the Department of Defense have concerns. Many leading scientists are extremely concerned about impacts to whales, fish, sea turtles, and invertebrates. And finally, local citizens who live along the coast or care about the oceans and the marine life are concerned. And so if you are concerned and want to make an impact to make a difference, you can tell your local, state, or congressional representatives that you oppose seismic airgun blasting. You could help us gather petitions in your community. You could submit your own public comment, and they're due July 6th. Or you could sign an online petition that we have up on our website. And there's more info at stopthedrill.org and on Twitter at Protect Our Coast. So thank you for your time, and I'll pass it on to the next speaker.
everyone. I'm Jeff Waters. As he said, I'm Director of Government Relations at Ocean Conservancy. We're a national ocean conservation organization who focuses very heavily on federal ocean policy. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about ocean acidification. This room, all of us in this room, we're a little bit more educated than kind of the average person on a lot of these matters. So other than me just mentioning ocean acidification, raise your hand if you have heard of ocean acidification before. Okay, now keep your hands up. Look around the room. Okay, this is amazing. So you can put your hands down now. So I will tell you that a decade ago, there is no way that number of hands would have gone up. A decade ago, no one knew what ocean acidification was. A decade ago, this issue was totally not on the map. It was a very real threat, but it was not yet on the map. And I think it's largely on the map today because of oysters. So that's where I'm going to start. I don't know if many of you have heard kind of the oyster story on what happened on the West Coast, but that's at least where I'm going to start today. The basic gist of what happened on the West Coast is about a decade ago. The way the oyster industry works is that you have farmers who raise oysters out in the ocean. Sometimes they use natural reproduction, but more often than not, they use hatcheries to actually get what they call oyster seed. The first time I heard that, I thought it was a little weird that you call an animal a seed. But these hatcheries literally produced oyster larvae and little baby oysters that they then sell to farmers who then put them out in the water and raise them in their farms. So in the same way that you would buy seed and raise corn, you buy seed and you raise oysters. Well, about a decade ago, we ran into this huge problem because for some bizarre reason, all up and down the West Coast, in Washington, Oregon, California, all at the same time, all of these hatcheries stopped producing seed. Everything started dying, and nobody knew why. Well, after a lot of work with some really fantastic academics and folks at NOAA and some federal agencies, they figured out that, unfortunately, ocean acidification was very much the root of the problem. And I've heard this story told a lot of different times from a lot of different people, and so rather than kind of continuing to tell the story on my own, I'm actually going to use someone else's words because I've heard it told much more effectively than I can say in my own words. So I'm going to read for you just for a moment, if you'll kind of indulge me, some testimony that was presented by a shellfish farmer named Brett Bishop back in 2008 as he was kind of articulating what was happening to his shellfish farm in this moment when all of a sudden, this is before they found a solution, but when all of a sudden they had no seed and the industry was looking at potentially an imminent collapse and end of oyster production on the West Coast. So this is from his testimony. My name is Brett Bishop, and today I'm representing commercial shellfish growers on the Pacific Coast from Alaska to California. My family's farm is on Little Skookum Bay in Mason County. We are a traditional family farm with tides. My parents live next door. Mom is 91 and Dad is 93. My two teenage boys are the sixth generation, to live on the old homestead and grow clams and oysters in Little Skookum Bay. We're typical of most other shellfish growers, and we're all facing unprecedented problems. Our largest producer of larvae, Whiskey Creek Hatchery, has in fact had to close their doors temporarily and lay off staff. Growers have been donating funds to Whiskey Creek to aid them in their research solutions for hatcheries. I need to be clear about this. The current situation puts both the marine ecosystem and shellfish growers in extreme jeopardy. Diminished natural reproduction coupled with failing hatcheries puts us in a position where we stand to lose it all. From the perspective of the Bishop family, it looks like this. We've invested everything we have and everything that we know into our farm. We've been growing as we could afford to for the last 124 years. We have a mortgage with the Farm Credit Services. We employ 27 people year-round with gross sales of $2.8 million. If we can't grow our oysters, the bank will foreclose on the mortgage. We will lose the farm, our homes, and 6 generations of our hopes and dreams and investments. That is most everything that we hold dear. So basically in that moment, a decade ago, this whole phenomenon of carbon emissions and this theoretical thing called ocean acidification that a few marine scientists had sort of been pontificating about, all of a sudden became incredibly, incredibly real. And so that's what started many of us on this journey to try to figure out what's going on with ocean acidification and try to find solutions, because it became very urgent very, very quickly. So this isn't a super technical talk. I'm beyond just telling the oyster story. My goal is to kind of give you a basic overview of what ocean acidification is, so you know a little bit about the phenomenon, talk a little bit about where it's happening or where it might be happening next. And more than anything, though, what I'd like to convey to you is who is at risk. Because this isn't some just theoretical global phenomenon. This is impacting real people in real places with real businesses. These are our neighbors, our communities, and our family members. And we always have to remember that. So going into the chemical problem, because there are a bunch of different layers to this problem. The basic chemical problem is carbon emissions, right? As carbon emissions go up into, because we emit carbon into the atmosphere, the ocean wants to stay in flux with the atmosphere, and so the ocean absorbs a huge amount of the carbon emissions that we put up into the atmosphere. So a lot of the carbon ends up in the ocean. So as you can see, the typical graph where carbon dioxide percentage goes up in the atmosphere. The carbon dioxide concentration in the ocean has also been going up and up and up. And globally, that also means that as carbon dioxide is absorbed, that the pH of the ocean is going down and down, which is where the term acidification comes from. It's not that the water is acidic, but it is becoming more acidic. Layer onto that, so the biology problem, so the problem that kind of results in actual harm is that there are some really important molecules in the ocean environment that all life in the ocean depends on, in particular aragonite and calcite. These are molecules that there's enormous abundance of them in the water column in the ocean. And this is what makes up all of those shells of everything from plankton and krill all the way down to oysters, to crustaceans like crabs and lobsters, and coral reefs. So all of the the food web and a huge proportion of life in the ocean depends on these molecules. And as you change the pH, not getting into detail, but as you change the pH in the chemistry, the carbon chemistry of the water, you basically make it much, much more difficult for these important molecules to be taken up by living organisms. And so there's a point where essentially there is not enough aragonite and calcite in the water. That tends to usually stay pretty deep, but as acidification is happening, that really bad water is getting closer and closer to the surface. And it becomes a coastal problem because once you get closer enough to the surface, you occasionally have seasonal upwelling where this bad water with not enough calcite and aragonite essentially gets washed into the coastal zone. And that's exactly what was happening with oysters on the West Coast. We finally reached this tipping point where the bad water that was undersaturated in aragonite and calcite was washing into the coastal zone, making it so that the organisms who were used to having an abundance of these molecules could no longer access these molecules, which made it so that when they're in their most vulnerable stages, in their larval stages and when they're reproducing, these organisms couldn't survive. They simply couldn't make it. So that's kind of the physical problem as it exists, which of course results in a very real people problem. And the most prevalent example that we've had is shellfish and oysters on the West Coast, but it is not going to stay there. They were simply the first in line, and this problem is going to show itself in other parts of the country probably sooner rather than later. So I'm going to talk about two specific areas that might be kind of next. We don't know for sure in terms of timing, but these are areas of worry and areas of concern where there are specific industries and communities that depend on ocean resources. The first, of course, is coral reefs. I mentioned coral reefs earlier. Corals are extremely sensitive to these kinds of issues because they build their shells. Corals are actually built using these molecules that are so important. And so they're very sensitive to the carbon chemistry. So who you see there is a scientist named Dr. Kim Yates from USGS. She's studying this problem in terms of ocean acidification's potential impact in southern Florida and on coral reefs in the Florida Keys. This is so you can see her not with the diving mask, hard at work. And, there are a lot of worrying signs. So not only USGS, but we've got Professor Chris Langdon at the University of Miami, who also kind of complements the field work that Kim does with a lot of work in the laboratory, where he's able to, in a laboratory setting, try to understand why some corals can survive and do okay under low pH stresses, while others cannot do okay. There's a lot of genetic variation. There's a lot more that we don't know than we do know. It's kind of like oysters in the beginning, early days, where we have a lot more questions than we have answers, but the answers that we do have so far are very worrisome and make us know that we need to learn a lot more. The other area I want to touch on very briefly is Dungeness crab on the West Coast. So you're seeing a photo here of Josh Churchman. He's a Dungeness crab fisherman out in Central California. And, this is something, much like corals, where, coral reefs are besieged by a huge number of threats and things that, they're getting slammed by every side. Dungeness crab is another example of an industry where ocean acidification poses a threat, but it's obviously not the only threat. They've had huge problems with domoic acid recently, which may or may not have a relation to carbon emissions. It's shut down their fishery. But ocean acidification is kind of looming as a potential threat. And there's been a lot of really good work being done to try to figure out whether, once again, the young life stages, when Dungeness crab are at their most vulnerable, how vulnerable are they to the carbon chemistry? And do they, fare much more poorly under acidic conditions than historic conditions? So this is obviously a baby crab, but what we're most interested in is the larval stage, which is when they're in the water column. They're actually, swimming around. They're part of plankton. They call them planktonic. It's a planktonic stage, which simply means that they're out there along with krill and any number of small organisms, and they're a very important food source before they get big. And some of the worrying indications are that hatchery success, so the eggs tend to hatch into larvae seemingly just fine, but the survivability of larvae when you ramp up the CO2 levels gets to be very worrisome. So it might be a very foreboding sign for this industry moving forward, because they've done a lot of lab tests to try to figure this out and basically conduct essentially a time machine experiment where they try to, in a laboratory setting, replicate the carbon conditions that we anticipate in the coming decades and the coming years to see how these critters fare under those future conditions. So in general, these are just two examples. I could talk about lobster in Maine. I could talk about shellfish on the East Coast. I could talk about any number of other locations and critters and industries that depend on those things. But in general, I think that no one said it better than a fisherman from the Gulf of Mexico named Donald Waters, where he said, this is just a devastating ghost lurking in the shadows. He basically said, we don't know whether we're going to be hit, but we might be hit. And if it's anything like what happened on the West Coast in the oyster industry, you could get hit overnight and not know what was coming and not really know how to react. So it's a very scary thing for many of our coastal communities that rely very heavily on these ocean resources. And so at the end of the day, I think what we try to do is we try to focus on these faces, the faces of the folks in these communities and in these industries and in these businesses who rely on ocean resources very heavily for their livelihood. We rely on them for our food and for many of the things that we get out of the oceans as citizens, whether we live in Iowa or Maine or Florida or Alaska. And so that's who we fight for. This is who we fight for. And so as you think about and talk about ocean acidification to one another and to your friends and to your colleagues, I encourage you to talk about it not as a global phenomenon, not as something that's happening in theory or across the planet at a big scale. Talk about it as something that's happening at a local scale with specific people. This is happening to specific communities, and it's happening to families. So that's who we're fighting for, and that's who I will hope that you all will help me fight for. Thank you.
So I'm Kristen Yarincik with the Consortium for Ocean Leadership, and I'm going to take a fairly broad look at ocean science for you today. Thank you for being here. I think what you're doing is really important. More than ever, we need unified voices in Washington. So the Consortium for Ocean Leadership serves as the unified voice for ocean science in the U.S. We represent the leading oceanographic research institutions, as well as some industry, aquaria, and other nonprofits. We regularly convene ocean researchers with the federal government and other stakeholders to identify ocean science priorities, and also the best available science to make policy, management, and conservation decisions. We communicate and educate for the need for ocean science, but also the benefits of a robust national capacity in ocean science and technology. So I want to talk a little bit more about our education mission. It starts with creating awareness and building understanding. Of course, we need champions for the ocean today, but we also need to make sure that we're supporting the next generation in becoming our future ocean leaders. Fewer than half of high schools in the US actually offer any kind of earth or environmental science course. This is according to a national survey of schools and teachers. And ocean science wasn't even mentioned in that report, so we have to just assume that it's included in that category. The number might actually be much less. So if our future generation is not learning about the oceans in school, we have to create opportunities for them to learn. The Consortium has a program called the National Ocean Sciences Bowl, or NOSB. This is a national high school level academic competition. It creates exposure to ocean science and provides students with an opportunity for some deep learning. And ocean science covers all of the disciplines of science: geology, chemistry, physics, biology, as well as technology, engineering, and math. And the ocean provides real-life scenarios for students to apply their knowledge. So one really great thing about the NOSB is that it directly connects students to researchers and ocean science professionals. Each of our 25 regional bowls is hosted by a university or other research institution, and each of those institutions come together to bring 1,500 volunteers each year to the program, and these volunteers are very excited to share their experience. I think Danny was one, yeah, and research with these students. And it also gives the students an opportunity to learn more about university programs and laboratories that help them to think about ocean science as a possible career path. So each of the winners of our regional bowls advanced to a national finals. This year's champions came from Santa Monica, California. Prior to that was Albany, California. And before you start to think there's a pattern here, our 2014 and 15 winners were actually from Boise, Idaho. Danny mentioned I'm director of this program, so obviously I love it and I can go on forever, but the main takeaway I want to leave you with on this is that NOSB develops stronger students and students who understand our changing ocean, so that regardless of the career path that they do take, they can be knowledgeable and make the right decisions to help us address our growing environmental concerns and the climate challenges that we face as a global society for our planet and also, importantly, our oceans, because our oceans provide us with so many services and resources. For one, phytoplankton in the ocean produce half of our oxygen. The ocean also provides us with food, seafood that we eat, of course, but also products like mayonnaise, yogurt, and ice cream contain marine-based ingredients like algae. And fish meal is fed to cows and also included in agricultural fertilizers. Studying marine organisms has led to a variety of medical advances. For example, studying sea sponges had led to treatments for cancers and also for AIDS. We already extract energy from the ocean in the form of oil and gas, and offshore wind is becoming more prevalent, but we have lots of unrealized potential still in harnessing energy from renewable energy, from waves, tides, and temperature gradients. This is an example of wave energy production. So we're also poised to start mining in the ocean, on the seafloor, as well as in these hydrothermal vent environments. The vents create deposits that contain gold, silver, copper, manganese, zinc. And finally, the ocean, of course, is our great regulator of climate. It takes carbon out of the atmosphere, and it also stores a tremendous amount of heat. And I'm sure you've been hearing a lot about that throughout this conference. So for all we do know about the ocean, there's a lot we still don't know. 95% of the ocean remains unexplored, and most of that unexplored territory is in the deep sea. And I have a few examples of why that's important. So in 2010, the Deepwater Horizon spilled millions of barrels of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. This happened at 1,500 meters deep, or about a mile. And because of all the industry in the Gulf of Mexico, this body of water is actually quite well known, but we still lacked important information about the ecosystem and the biodiversity and the behavior of released oil and dispersant at that depth. And so as we're pushing further and further offshore to meet our energy needs and looking at less explored areas like the Arctic, we really need to have a much better understanding of these ecosystems. In 2014, Malaysian Air 370 crashed in the Indian Ocean. And what complicated our search is that we really lack good bathymetric maps of the seafloor. We've actually mapped the surface of Mars much better than we have most of the bottom of our own ocean. In 2015, a group of scientists had an expedition out to a site where in 1989, researchers conducted an experiment to look at the impacts of mining, such as for these manganese nodules. And so what they did was scrape about a 1 square kilometer patch of seafloor to see what the impacts would be. And so this was a unique opportunity decades later to go back to this original site to see what had changed. And as it turns out, you can see in that figure, the scrape marks were still very visible after all that time. They were not hidden by sedimentation. And in the tracks, the composition of species was still much different than it was prior to the disturbance. In fact, even some species of bacteria were no longer present. So what this tells us is that the deep sea is far more fragile than we can imagine while we're sitting far away from that on land, but it's also very slow to recover. So the average depth of the ocean is 3,600 meters, or about 2¼ miles, but it can be as deep as 11,000 meters, such as in the Marianas Trench. But we have almost no routine measurements, what we call observations, below 2,000 meters. And what we do have is largely uncoordinated and definitely underfunded. And humans have a growing presence in the deep sea. It's our final frontier for commercial exploitation. But it's not just our direct footprint that's having an impact. The changing climate, warming air, and sea surface temperatures are having and will continue to have a tremendous impact on the ocean, including the deep sea. So a study published earlier this year in the journal Nature indicated that globally, the ocean's oxygen content has declined by 2% over the last 50 years. But these small changes in oxygen levels can have big impacts in the ecosystems because only bacteria can survive in low to no oxygen conditions. And as water warms, it actually becomes less able to hold oxygen. And then the ocean becomes more stratified because these warmer oxygen-rich layers are less likely to sink into mix with the deeper, less oxygenated waters. And so this leads to dead zones. And dead zones further exacerbate environmental issues by producing and releasing poisonous nitrous oxide gas into the atmosphere. So if you can sort of play this scenario out in your head, it's not good. Sea level rise will also, deep sea will have a big role in sea level rise. It's not just the melting of ice that we need to be concerned about, but the ocean warms and it expands. This is called thermal expansion. And water at pressure, such as in the deep sea, is going to expand much more than the surface layers. But what we don't know is how much heat and how fast heat is being transferred from the surface layers to the deep sea, and this complicates our ability to predict the impact of thermal expansion on sea level rise. And because the ocean has such a high heat capacity, and because so much of the ocean is the deep sea, the rate at which heat is being distributed and retained in the deep sea is important for our predictions of the rate of climate change. And so this is contributing to our uncertainty around the degree of warming and also the timing of certain tipping points. So we need more data to help us fill these science gaps so that we can better understand and predict what's happening in the ocean and what that will mean for people on land and for the health of our planet. And because the ocean is so deep and covers so much of our planet, accessing it is expensive and difficult. So we can't just rely on ships to get researchers the data they need. We need to develop innovative technologies and approaches to getting data. So for example, we have autonomous underwater vehicles, and with improvements in things like battery life, we can leave these out at sea for longer and longer periods of time. We have a program called Argo. These are autonomous floats just drifting around the ocean. They were deployed 17 years ago and have been continuously diving and ascending through the top 2,000 meters of the ocean collecting climate observations. And now scientists are developing a new version of this technology called Deep Argo, which, as the name implies, will be designed to handle pressures at up to 6,000 meters depth. We can let animals do some of the work for us. So last decade, a program called the Census of Marine Life demonstrated the feasibility of using tags on animals to not only learn more about the behavior of the animals themselves, but to collect data about the environments that they encounter. And currently, this technology is being integrated into our National Ocean Observing System, which is called IUS. And this is just a cool technology that I read about only like 2 weeks ago. This initiative called SmartFin is developing surfboard fins equipped with sensors to collect important ocean characteristic data on important ocean characteristics. And while this is actually designed for a very accessible part of the ocean where people surf, it does address a particular challenge in that surf zone, equipment deployed can tend to be really bashed around. And it's also a cool citizen science initiative. So if I could leave you with just a few key takeaway messages, the US needs to reinvigorate its leadership in ocean science because oceans are important for our health, our economy, our security, not to mention our climate. We need more champions for the oceans, especially in Congress. Ocean science and ocean health are not just issues for coastal states, and changes happening even in the most remote parts of the ocean are going to have impacts for people on land. We need more ocean science education so that all students have access to learning about the ocean so that they can become our future scientists, future public servants, business leaders, and just knowledgeable citizens who can make informed decisions. And finally, we need more funding for research, for ocean observations, for data analysis and modeling to help us fill these very critical science gaps, because this can help us minimize our uncertainty and hopefully help to bring us together a bit more as a nation and across parties so that we can make sure that these worst-case scenarios don't come to fruition. Thanks.